Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Kyle Silvestro, founder and CEO of SyTrue. Kyle has been involved in healthcare industry activities addressing natural language processing solutions and has a deep understanding of clinical data and clinical workflows. Kyle, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Kyle, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your background in NLP solutions and what you and your team are working on today.
Yeah, my background is kind of somewhat eclectic. I fell into the world of NLP about 17 years ago. So I had a firm consulting company at the time where I was assisting organizations grow in a number of different ways, and had a client that was focused on medical necessity. So utilization of care, levels of care, really kind of case management, disease management. And in that role, I saw healthcare, right, from an outsider's perspective, sitting here with the catcher's mitt on. And we were catching patients as they showed up in the ER, right, treating patients that tended to be the sickest, at the most intensive setting, at the highest level of cost, and not really focusing resources on moving these individuals into the community and treating them before they showed up in the ER at an appropriate setting at a much lower price point. And as I was sitting here thinking of the somewhat lunacy that was going on, I was kind of getting to a point of thinking about it differently, right? How could you get to concurrent coding and CPOE? And if you could do that, you could automate this process, right? Enabling us to unleash a torrent of qualified healthcare individuals into the community to be able to treat patients, right? And treat conditions. A friend of mine at the time was working for a company that she defined kind of as a think tank, and really couldn't define it in a good way. I started looking at this and said, oh my goodness, it's the Holy Grail, right? It's NLP. So my journey down that path then started, right, with a company called Language and Computing that was one of the pioneers in the space. And so sold my position in my company and had gotten a job for the first time in a long time, and was really able to get kind of a real world equivalent PhD in informatics, NLP, machine learning, AI within that organization as we were deploying new technologies into our marketplace. Fast forward a little while, then, that company got acquired by Nuance. I helped commercialize some other technology, and then started thinking about SyTrue and started thinking about the challenges, right, that I had seen in pushing these early technologies into the marketplace. What you see when you push early technology into the marketplace is it's hard, right? You don't understand a lot. So there's a lot of wins, but there's also a lot of failures, right? And so for me, I'm somebody who forget my wins pretty quickly, but remember the losses. So as I started thinking about all of the challenges that we had, pushing this new technology into the marketplace, it was really under that kind of design of how do I actually do this on the level of CMS, right? How do I enable us to concurrently process every document created and then be able to create almost a publishing system to automate 20 ways downstream? So you eliminate the army of humans that we have in this archaic process doing nothing but reading data that's created annually. And through that, SyTrue was born to really address kind of waste and inefficiencies in the healthcare system, focusing in on where we have narrative data, which is 80% of information created today, and creating points of automation around there to enable functionalities like payment integrity, so fraud, waste, and abuse, risk adjustment, social determinants of health, population health, and a whole host of other activities. So a little bit of history and kind of a little bit about what we do today.
Great. So you've identified sort of the big hole in the broader health IT system, which is, not to put too fine a point on it, most of the data, which is not organized, which is free text, which comes into systems in the form of PDFs, et cetera, and is sort of lost to most systems. So it sounds like you have some thoughts about how to capture that data, how to mine that information, how to bring it in to more structured formats through NLP. And I hear you and other companies trying to do this at the margins. But in recent years, we've seen some of the biggest technology companies in the marketplace wanting to get into healthcare. And one would think that they might be able to leverage their capabilities within the healthcare marketplace. But we've seen some spectacular retreats. Most recently, as we're speaking, IBM, Watson getting out of healthcare. We've seen advances and retreats in Google around healthcare, and there are others. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how healthcare is different. Healthcare is hard, as you were starting to say a moment ago. Why is this harder for the entrenched incumbents?
Hubris, ego, the prospect of throwing technology at a marketplace that's a $4 or $5 trillion cottage industry, right? And I think they don't understand the cottage industry. They don't understand the fundamental nuts and bolts of what it takes to truly be able to make an impact in these areas. So they see the next hot new product line and they start chasing it, right, to be able to try to capture market share, throwing tremendous amount of resources at something in hopes that this is going to come along. So it's, hiring big names, making big splashes and press releases, but truly not having a long-sighted view and a true understanding of what it's going to take to make an impact. I can't think of any major company that's made anything significant in the way of an impact that's come in as an outside of the amount of noise that they've made, the amount of advertising dollars that they've thrown around. So you've had plenty of people covering their stories because they're paying for placement, but nobody's really looking under the covers and saying, what value are you creating? They are sucking the lifeblood out of this economy, which is its innovators, the entrepreneurs that come out of industry, that come out of companies, that come out of hospitals, that come out of health plans, truly understand, have a keen understanding of how to solve those problems, how to enable organizations to make money, not just spend millions and millions of dollars chasing a computer that can play video games or answers questions on Jeopardy. And then small vendors get it, the air gets sucked out of the room because it's hard for them to compete, especially in a health plan where, an organization like Amazon or Microsoft or Google may throw 12 sales reps at it, occupying everybody from the C-suite down to every other division, which is an effective enterprise sales strategy. However, it doesn't necessarily yield the results that are promised. So why do they do it? It's chasing dollars for their own gain and the gain of a small minority. But the impact that it has on the vast majority of organizations is significant because it prevents advancement. It's eliminating those that can actually solve the problem today. And let me just give an example. You look at Amazon Comprehend Medical. In my opinion, it's an embarrassment, right? It's technology that is 7-8 years past dated, that has no home, is trying to find a fit, isn't effective. It's going to cost an organization hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in personnel just to get it to be effective. They make all this noise. They come out into this marketplace and they do everybody a disservice because they're lowering expectations. They're saying, oh, this technology doesn't work, and it's Amazon, so it must be this case for everybody, despite the fact that is, an alpha product that should have never been brought to market. And I think you can see the challenges they're having by having to reduce the price by 95% and making announcements of things that should have been basic in the product when it came out, like SNOMED. So, if something's not worth $1 to begin with, reducing it by 95 cents doesn't make it any more valuable. It's still trash. And that's a lot of what's being pushed out by big tech today.
And there's a commentary tucked in there about being sort of in perpetual beta, which is sort of the standard approach, some would say, with respect to big tech, as opposed to something that is going to be mission critical in healthcare, which can't afford to be deployed in beta form. I guess the other question that is raised by what you're saying is, do we then need to rely on cottage industry, so to speak, vendors to deal with a cottage industry of healthcare, as opposed to large platform, large enterprise vendors? Is it that healthcare is hard, or is it that healthcare is local, and every install is going to be unique, and therefore we need an army of smaller vendors? Or is the truth somewhere in between?
I think it cuts across both of those. Let me take an example from very large going down to very small. Most of the administration of healthcare on a national level, take Social Security for administration, are run by defense contractors. They're not run by people that understand healthcare. And when you look at a problem like Social Security disability, where it was taking 6, 8, 10 months for our veterans to have their cases reviewed, right? And when there's been opportunity to create automation to solve these problems, and I've been involved in a couple of these bids to try to solve this problem, where you have an organization like Lockheed running the bid, and you have a subsidiary of Lockheed bidding on the project. Lockheed's getting paid by the person, by the hour, by the file. Why is there any incentive to create automation there when it's going to essentially remove money from their own pockets? When you go talk to congressmen or senators, like one of the longest running members, Wally Herger, who I met with, talked about creating jobs in a small economically deprived town, talked about the benefits that this would have for our veterans. I get 10 minutes of his time, start looking around, seeing Lockheed planes on the wall. Never hear from the guy again. So you have that level of just madness, in my opinion. Coast Guard getting awarded contracts to Northrop Grumman to build an EMR system, when you have a perfectly good commercial one like Epic or Cerner or eClinicalWorks, or a number of that have been deployed successfully time and time again. Healthcare is dirty, right? If you take it down to the individual level. I always tell people if they've been to a hospital, they've been to a single hospital, because despite the fact that they may have an Epic EMR, they have the ability to customize it. They have the ability to customize outputs. They have the ability to, roll new updates when they choose. So you have on a local system, a lot of variability on the way that they're documenting and, managing care that's ultimately going to roll up to a national system. So if you start with, point of care and roll that up to a national level, right, there are a number of layers and intermediaries in between. And each of those have to have, in my opinion, kind of a specialized skill set and understanding of what's actually happening here along those transaction points. And so you have organizations that don't really have a background or specialty and are maybe being brought in for scale. You have archaic way of thinking that you still have to throw humans at problems, where you have true technology that can actually solve it, if it was allowed, but the incentive structures are misaligned. And then as you look at it kind of as a mid-tier, how do you enable this, right? How do you create incentives where this information can flow freely? And they're not there with, these major entities just trying to come in and attack. Truly from a commercial perspective, not understanding the, intricacies of what's happening. So they don't really see the cost cutting and the value that the marketing departments claim.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Kyle Silvestro, founder and CEO of SyTrue. Kyle, a moment ago you said if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital, and that's a comment that resonates. In one of my previous lives, I did some consulting work with academic medical centers, and we used to say, if you've seen one academic medical center, you've seen one academic medical center. Every one is organized slightly differently. And again, the question is, are there universal building blocks that we can put together, that we can hope to put together in order to help rationalize healthcare? There are, you mentioned some EMR companies, and the fact that each install becomes customized in such a way that they are less interoperable than we might otherwise think. There's a whole industry of folks who are built up around these systems in order to try to create or facilitate that interoperability and extraction of information from the systems that we're talking about that are supposed to be interoperable. How are we doing? Are we making progress? Is there opportunity, given some recent changes in regulations, et cetera, in implementations, whether it's around interoperability, whether it's around TEFCA, whatever the next great acronym from the federal government is going to be? Is that helpful? Does it move us in the right direction?
Friends of mine used to joke with me that I had semantic interoperability tattooed on me somewhere, because that's how long I've been talking. talking about this? The answer is yes and no, right? So much of what was implemented was short-sighted, right? Forcing physicians out of a standardized workflow that was efficient, right? And enabled them to move throughout their day in a productive fashion is unconscionable, honestly. Why somebody thought that was going to be acceptable is beyond me. And we're seeing that, right? And we're seeing the impacts of that on physicians today. We're seeing the impact of that on the clinical documentation, right? We're seeing impacts of this across the board. And in doing that, the thinking wasn't in place to say, great, now I'm going to force electronic capture. How do I ensure that everything is actually shareable, right? I mean, I remember not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, right? EMRs didn't let data out of their system. It was a closed network, right? And in order to get something out without a court order, it was almost impossible, right? So you got to remember, these systems were not built on the basis of interoperability. They're not based on the basis of clinical efficiency or clinical outcomes. They're based to try to create, automated bill capture. So have we made progress and gains? Yes and no. I mean, 95, 98% of the data that I see today is a PDF, which is a byproduct of, an output of an EMR or somebody going on site to collect information. And we process billions of these annually. And then if you look at CCDA, it is complete with free text in there, right? There is more free text than there is structured data. But unfortunately, what would have been in a, let's say, transcribed document, something that was 400 pages, is blown out to 4,200 pages or some unfathomable number, right? Because of all of the noise that's added through that EMR. And the information, headers and footers and breaks and, something that was never really designed for kind of computable consumption, let's say. And so, yeah, I mean, has billions of dollars been spent on interoperability and creating plumbing between the systems? Yeah. But again, when you still have the majority of it in narrative nodes, is it really getting you where you want to go? So I think what we need is a super highway, right? This easy on-ramp that allows organizations and companies to create this ability to, turn content into semantically interoperable data that can drive downstream outcomes. And if you think about that, we do have those common frameworks. The problem is they're not in the workflow of revenue. So if you think about billing, right? Billing only needs a couple data points, problems and procedures, right? And then needs some maybe supporting signs and symptoms. And if you feed those 7 problems and those CPTs into a grouper, you're going to get a code, right? But what do you leave? If you have a 4,000-page record, you just lost and left 98% of that information in that record. If you've read a PDF, or if you've audited a file, or if you looked at it from a risk adjustment standpoint. The problems we're trying to solve are very, very narrow. And in solving a narrow problem, you leave the longitudinal data behind. So, it's kind of, we're solving individual problems and we're creating some uniqueness, but we're not, enabling and incentivizing organizations to create a semantic interoperable longitudinal record that can truly drive automation downstream.
So do the incremental changes that we're seeing over time with respect to value-based care and payer-driven, population-based FHIR interoperability, are these steps in the right direction? Are they realistic? Are they going to be realized in our lifetimes?
Until the next flavor comes out, right? In the next standard. I mean, in the last 10 years, how many different standards have there been that have, people have implemented, going from direct to blue button to CCDA to now FHIR? Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a step in the right direction. But what you're doing is just moving structured data around, right? Which should have been a cornerstone to legislation that, came out a decade ago, but should have been a cornerstone to, a number of these EMRs to begin with.
How do we extract from the unstructured 98% and move into a more structured series of data points that we can be using here?
I mean, I think in a utopian world, right? Or if you were to go back to a different time in a paradigm shift, if you enabled, physicians, which they're kind of doing in a more expensive form now, to just dictate, right? Let them do what they did 15, 20 years ago. And in this case, we now have scribes sitting in the room with them. Years ago, we had transcriptionists, right? If you were to take that data, right, and turn that into, run it through an NLP system, because at that point, you really have clean data there. You can extract problems, procedures, family history, social determinants of health, labs, immunizations, cultures, right? You truly could create this interoperable health record that's based on the appropriate coding systems that would become almost immediately available to start driving downstream care. It's going to be hard to get that level of color, right, that you can capture in a narrative note within structured data fields, unless you're asking a physician to stand in front of that monitor for a significant amount of time post-visit, which none of them do.
Right, or they'll hate you for
and
it,
are creating,
right?
Yeah, correct, and are creating huge inefficiencies. My doctor just types into the system his narrative note. So, and so all that data is essentially not usable unless somebody is actually reading it. And that's a challenge in healthcare today, right? If you touch a document once and you can read it, extract it, you can automate 20 processes that we currently have 20, more often not, individuals actively involved with, right? Reading the same data over and over and over again, just for their own slant, right, on the problem that they're solving.
Right. So I think what you're saying, if I can reframe that, is that we're making a huge investment in accessing and using that data, but it's the wrong investment. And we could invest in looking at that data, extracting it, systematizing it, processing it, categorizing it, so it would then be accessible much more easily at the other end of the pipe, so to speak.
That's right. And if you can do that, I mean, I think here's something that's transformative, extremely impactful in healthcare. I was going to say this a little bit towards the end of our discussion here today, but it's pertinent to what we're talking about now.
Well, here we are. We're getting towards the end, so I'll ask you to frame it, if you will, in sort of what's achievable, but also in terms of my final question, which is, if you're to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what's one thing that you would hope or maybe expect to see has changed dramatically? So where are we going? What's the next step? And is it this year? Is it 5 years? Where are we looking?
Let me say hope. Why do we need medical billing? I've never understood that. And I'm not talking about a capitated payment model, but if the care that's being provided is medically necessary, meaning it is appropriate for the condition that individual has, no matter if it's at the intensive care or being treated in a clinic, why do we bill anything? If we could enable, because billing is a function that just does nothing but cost money. It's costing money to collect money. And organizations give up 8%, 12%, 16% of revenue to have somebody bill on their behalf. And that's something that adds zero value to the patient whatsoever. None. The patient doesn't benefit at all. But a percentage of their money that they pay is going into the ability for a hospital to collect. And why do we have this? I mean, it feels like we have a lack of trust, right, between providers in the system. Insurance companies and hospitals, right, or providers have been at odds here. But insurance companies have that much money also, right? They have to calculate those bills. They have to audit those bills. They're paying out billions of dollars only to recoup money in overpayments, right, because there's lack of transparency in the system. CMS is losing hundreds of billions every year in fraud. Medicaid plans are washing out billions in fraud because they don't have a system in place to think about, how do I concurrently review all of the information? How do I create a system where all this information has to be shared, right? Now what do I have? I have a interoperable longitudinal record, but as a system, if we've just reduced or removed 10 to 12% of cost, right, out of that system, and we've created a model where all data can be concurrently processed because it's not locked in an EMR, right? There's what I've estimated about $1 trillion in cost savings here, right, that this system can deploy. So what does that mean? That means every American's healthcare can be paid for without them having to pay a cent, right? Healthcare is covered across the board by shifting administrative, archaic ways that we're thinking about processes right now into a modernized way of actually being able to make an impact in care. And why is this meaningful, right? Because if you think about something that we know it has an impact in patients, right, it's clinical trials. And we know that if you get a patient in a clinical trial, they typically have a better likelihood of survival. If you get that same patient in that clinical trial into a counseling group, you get better outcomes there. If you could get that same patient information around, hey, here are all the bad things that are going to happen to you, potentially could happen to you. Here are the things that you don't need to worry about, right? We move that level of anxiety, which as a patient is the worst, right? Here are the things that you need to call your doctor about. You're creating a playing field where everybody is incentivized to cooperate. right? Insurance companies end up getting their high value patients off their payroll. Patients end up getting, better care because of this. And ultimately, actually, physicians make more money in the process because they get paid more to consult, individuals than would actually be enrolled in clinical trials. So we have actually something that's uniform that makes sense here. The same thing gets applied to adverse events with drugs or medications, right? Contraindications. So much of what happens today is because we lack the information we need to be able to drive prospective or preemptive care. And the information's at our fingertips. So what would I like to see in the 5 years? I want to see this, I want to see the power of, unlocked to be able to know, learn what we thought we knew was wrong, right? And improvements in those models. Because I think there's a lot of it once that happens, to see a world where we have a free flow of semantically interoperable data, right? Which are going to drive immense economic opportunities downstream. They're going to address huge economic disparities in the U.S. population today, because if you can get people healthier and impact them before they end up with renal disease, what's the cost of them, to the society? What's the decreased cost in their care, right? So the economic, impact is multifaceted, but is truly on a level that will, in my opinion, shift GDP, right? If you can get to a model like that and shift us all in a positive way.
Well, Kyle, that's a compelling vision of the future. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me on the show today.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.